And if later on you want to, ask a question that you don't want to have recorded and out there, you can always message us and ask us to pause the recording. But now let me introduce properly our speakers. So we have Steve Reicher, who, let me see if I can spotlight for everyone. Okay, like this. We have Steve Reicher, who is a well-known social psychologist at the University of St. Andrews in the UK. And I just want to note that Steve was probably one of the first and just very few social psychologists to even use the word resistance and not just collective action, and to also write about resistance in violent and repressive contexts, which is the focus of our entire, webinar here, as you all know. So he has some really interesting and important papers on resistance during the Holocaust, in resistance in concentration camps, in Bulgaria during World War II, and South Africa. And so, yeah, in a way, Steve, I think you brought these topics into social psychology, and for that we are grateful. But today, Steve is here to talk about his experience organizing with the South African anti-apartheid movement, academic movement in, I believe, the 1980s, right? Then, let me see, remove the spotlight. Then we have Sami Hermez, who is an associate professor of anthropology, not a psychologist. Thank you for joining us, at Northwestern University in Qatar, and is also a longtime BDS activist who has worked on several campaigns, including the American Anthropological Association's campaign to adapt, or the campaign to have them adapt a resolution to boycott complicit Israeli academic institutions. So he also has a lot of organizing experience within and outside of academia around this. And I also just wanted to show his new book here that he recently published, very beautiful book, My Brother, My Land, A Story from Palestine. If you do not know it yet, please check it out. Thank you so much, Sami, also for joining us today at this late hour for you in Qatar. So the format of the session will be basically a discussion, a roundtable discussion. I don't know if it's around, if there are only two speakers, but anyway, Steve will first talk about the South African context for about 10 or 15 minutes. Then Sami will talk about his experience with what I just mentioned. And then afterwards, they will comment on the respective other contexts to also talk a little bit about the similarities and differences. And then we will open up to hopefully a really good discussion here with all of you. We have also a Jamboard that we like to use. Fuad, if you could send the link again. So this is simply like a whiteboard on Google where you can add some comments and notes if you would like to share them there. We always like to keep this as just an overview of the topics and questions that were asked. So feel free to put your questions there or any other information you would like to share on that board for collective note-taking. All right, and now let's get started. So Steve.
Okay, so hello everybody. I see from the list of participants a number of old friends, so hello to you, but hello to everybody. And thank you very much, Johanna, for inviting me to participate in this session. It's a real pleasure to take part. Let me start by saying something about my own history and how I became involved in the anti-apartheid movement. As Johanna said, a long time ago, in the late 70s, and I was involved until the end of apartheid in 94. My background is Jewish. My father managed to get out of Poland in 1940. My mother got out of Germany in 1934. They were amongst the few in their family who got out. And so, like many Jewish people, I grew up with an absence, with a lack of family, and read voraciously about the Holocaust from when I was very small. And it formed my understanding in many ways. It formed my politics. Even at the age of 11 and 12, it became clear to me that states and laws are not always right, and that sometimes there is a necessity to challenge unjust states and unjust laws. And as a psychologist, I was very much impacted by my reaction to the Holocaust. Johanna has done some wonderful work, Hillik Clark too, about different reactions to the Holocaust, different ways of understanding it. Some which say, I will never be a victim again, and I will make myself strong and tough so nobody can get at me. But others which say, I will never be a perpetrator, and I will never see anybody being a victim. And very much that was the tradition, even though I didn't know of the tradition, which formed my understanding. I became obsessed, as I say, by the Holocaust. I became obsessed by all forms of genocide, of humiliation, of destruction. And I became very much involved from a fairly young age in anti-racist activities. And as a psychologist, again, for me, the determining difference between the, if you like, the exclusive, narrow reaction to the Holocaust and the more inclusive, I will never be a perpetrator type of reaction, comes down to the notion of whether you think racism is inevitable or not. And I was struck by what seems to me to be the radical pessimism of Zionism, which says you can't fight it, you can't do anything about it. All you can do is retreat and make yourself so strong that anybody who threatens you will be obliterated. And much of my work comes down to trying to critique that notion of the inevitability of racism. There is something bred in the bone that makes human beings prejudiced. And a lot of my work seeks to understand the ways in which, in the first place, we racialize and create racial categories. And secondly, the conditions under which different groups come into conflict. Again, there is nothing inevitable about that. It's not bred in the bone. It's not an aspect of our psychology. It depends upon deliberate acts of ideology and leadership. It depends upon exclusions of particular others, setting them up as a threat, then reacting to their reactions by more and more intense threats. So in many ways, it seemed to me that the formation of an ethnic state is a perfect motor for creating conflict, for creating hatred, for creating the awful things that we see today. So very much my sense of myself, both politically and as an academic, were formed by those early experiences. And now, towards the end of my career, I've been doing it for over 40 years now, I still am obsessed by those questions, and there is so much more work to be done. When I was a student, I was at Bristol University, both as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate in the 70s and in the 80s. I became very involved politically. I became elected to the National Union of Students, to the National Executive of the National Union of Students, and I was given responsibility for the anti-racist and for the anti-apartheid portfolios. And student politics is often decried, I think, unfairly, and sometimes, yes, it is fairly trivial. And so I remember doing speaking tours with members of the ANC just out from Soweto. Remember, this was only a few years after Soweto. And that sense of struggle, of determination, the most remarkable people, impacted me hugely. And so I became very committed, and I continued being involved in the anti-apartheid movement, both as a local activist in different places where I lived and on the national committee. What I want to do today is to take you through a number of things. First of all, say something about the history of the movement. Then I want to go on and discuss its effectiveness. I want to look at some issues around sanctions, and I want to address the arguments against sanctions, because they're very similar today as they were then. I think one of the most important things that one needs to understand about the birth of what was first called the boycott movement, then the anti-apartheid movement, was that it did not come from people outside South Africa. It came from South Africa itself. The ANC and the Congress movement, the African National Congress, clearly the largest body involved in a coalition, I guess similar in some ways to the civil rights movement. The Congress movement from the mid-50s and late 50s started calling for sanctions. They started arguing for economic solidarity. In 1958, the leader of the ANC, Chief Albert Luthuli, Nobel Prize winner for peace. He said, economic boycott is one way in which the world at large can bring home to the South African authorities that they must mend their ways or suffer for them. This appeal is therefore directed to the people of Great Britain to strike a blow for freedom and justice in South Africa. A year later, on the 26th of June, 1959, a meeting in London formed the boycott movement. And there, Julius Nyerere, later the president of Tanzania, he said, "We are not asking you, the British people, for anything special. We are just asking you to withdraw your support from apartheid by not buying South African goods." And so 2 points, again. The anti-apartheid movement was not something we dreamt up. It's not something that we felt we were going to do for the good of South Africans. It was something that was asked of us by those organizations, by those hegemonic organizations, by those organizing the resistance struggle. It was not a patronizing imposition. It was very much a response. I think that's really critical. And the second thing is, it was nothing special. We weren't being asked to help. We were being asked to stop oppressing. A very modest demand. Very modest demand right now for Palestinians not to ask for help from Americans, but to ask Americans to stop sending the bombs which are falling on them and killing them right now. So it's a very modest demand in various ways. By the beginning of 1960, the campaigning started at a national level. In March 1960, there was a month of boycott, a month of consumer boycott, because at the beginning, it was a very simple and rather limited demand. It was asking individuals not to buy South African goods. When you go into a supermarket and you see Cape grapes or you see an Outspan orange, just don't buy it. And even now, if I see Cape and if I see Outspan, I have that emotional reaction to them. On March the 21st, in the midst of that campaign in 1960, the South African police shot and killed 69 Black people peacefully protesting against apartheid. And that galvanized the campaign. It led to it becoming broader, becoming international. It led to it becoming deeper, and it became wider. So what started off as an individual act, first of all, was institutionalized. There was a call on institutions to stop investing in South Africa, and also government at various levels began to demand changes. One of the most successful aspects of the campaign, for instance, was by local government, local councils in the UK. By the 1980s, about 120 declared themselves apartheid-free zones, that they would have nothing to do with South Africa. They wouldn't host South African artists, that they wouldn't stop South African goods. 2/3 of British people lived in the areas controlled by those councils. So that was very powerful indeed. The campaign became focused in various ways. So we focused on particular companies. Barclays Bank, one of the biggest banks in the UK, actually one of the slave banks. Most banks in the UK grew up to finance slavery one way or another. And the reason why Barclays was in Africa was because it was a slave bank. But Barclays, in the aftermath of the Soweto uprising of 1976, when thousands of school children had been shot dead by the South African forces and there was an economic crisis, Barclays financed South Africa, gave huge loans to South Africa. I remember most of my Saturdays during the 80s standing outside the Barclays Bank in Exeter and shouting at them one way or another. They must have got fairly tired of the sound of my voice. And the other was Shell, Shell Oil, because Shell was very heavily involved. Now, Barclays actually withdrew from South Africa in 1986. It was a remarkable victory. Shell never did, but at the same time, it had a huge impact on them. They lost 7% of their market share, which for a multinational is pretty vast. So these were pretty powerful campaigns. As I say, the campaign was broadened. To the economic boycott, we added the cultural boycott and the sporting boycott. The cultural boycott, which both involved academia, but also involved refusing South African artists appearing in the UK. Many councils refused to allow South African artists to appear. The Musicians' Union got the BBC to ban South African artists from appearing on the BBC. And the sporting boycott was in many ways very powerful because sport was central to the identity of South Africans. When you look with retrospect and listen to white South Africans, that sense of being excluded from the international sporting community really hit home. It had, some people say it was merely symbolic. It was more than symbolic. It impacted in various ways. And again, I remember various rugby matches of running on the pitch and trying to disrupt those games. And it got to a point where basically South African sport was a pariah. So the movement, and I'll come back to this in a moment, was a very powerful combination of individual and institutional action, working at different levels. And it's estimated that by the 1980s, 1 in 4 British people refused to buy South African goods. It had an incredible purchase. It was clearly the largest social movement in the UK. I remember in 1986, for instance, when the struggle was rising in South Africa, a demonstration where they'd expected to get 10, 20, 30,000 people. They got probably about 200,000 people in Trafalgar Square, packed into Trafalgar Square, with Jesse Jackson as one of the speakers. It was one of the most powerful demonstrations I've ever seen. And the anti-apartheid movement in many ways was the political and social movement of the time. So was it successful? Now, the first answer to that, and I think it's really important to say this, is that the boycott did not liberate South Africa. It would be wrong and it would be patronizing to say that it did, because what liberated South Africa was the actions of South Africans, the heroism of those young people, whether it was in Sharpeville, Soweto, or later, the struggles, the armed struggle against the apartheid regime. That's what liberated South Africa. But we played a role. The first was economic. Now, of course, the South Africans got round the boycott in various ways. Of course, they managed to smuggle their goods. For a long time, I think it was Bulgarian, it might have been Romanian wine, was suspiciously good because it was basically South African wine that had been relabeled. So the South Africans sold their wine, yes, but it cost them about an extra 20% in order to be able to do so. There was, if you like, a levy which was imposed by the boycott. And so when people say, and try and dismiss the boycott by saying, oh, it had no economic effect, no, it didn't have a total economic effect, but it had some economic effect. The second thing is that it empowered and gave a sense of support to the liberation struggle. You see, the first act, right, this was an encounter which I found quite remarkable. The first act of the student movement, the NUS, in the anti-apartheid boycott, was to do with the building of a big dam, the Cahora Bassa Dam in Mozambique, to supply electricity to South Africa. And there was an attempt to boycott the financing of it. And I remember years and years later, when I was involved in the struggle, meeting a person from Mozambique, and the first thing they mentioned was the Cahora Bassa Dam, and saying, knowing that students in the UK cared about this was immensely empowering. We did not feel alone. We knew we were part of a global struggle. And so there is that empowering effect. And at the same time, it demoralized the forces of apartheid. It demoralized those Afrikaners for whom sport was everything, knowing that you were a pariah, although they would put on a tough face and say, we don't care. And you hear that again today. It's still, being a pariah had a cost. You put all those things together, and I would argue that the campaign was part and parcel of the struggle. We were the junior partners. Of course we were the junior partners, but it made a difference. So when people make absolutist arguments, they say, oh, the economic boycott means nothing because you can get round it, they miss the point. There's a slogan by one of the big supermarkets we used to boycott called Tesco's: "Every little helps." Well, it might have been little, but it helped and it made a difference. Let me go on then, and I'll only be a few more minutes. I do apologize. I've probably gone over my time. By looking at some of the issues around sanctions. The first I just want to repeat is it's an incredibly important element that it was a solidarity campaign in which we were acting in ways that were asked of us by the struggle. And it also helped, of course, that the ANC, of course, it wasn't the only political force in South Africa. Of course, there was the PAC as well. There was conflict between them that was reflected to some extent in the UK. There were some people who supported the PAC and went against the anti-apartheid movement. But nonetheless, it was hard to argue that the dominant and the representative force of South African people and of the liberation struggle was the ANC. That, of course, was reflected by the landslide when the elections happened in 1994, and that they retained power for 30 years. I actually haven't seen the election results. They may not be in power in a day or two, since they have somewhat squandered that legacy. But nonetheless, at the time, it was quite clear that we were acting as was asked for us. And when people attacked the ANC and attacked the boycott, we could very clearly argue this isn't us saying this is the right thing to do. This is the South African people asking us to do something very simple and very modest. So I do think that issue of who asks for it and the clarity and the hegemony of the source of that call is really important. The second point is that what was so powerful about the movement is it gave you activities which united the personal and personal agency with the collective and the systemic. If I went into a supermarket and I didn't buy an Outspan orange, I didn't buy Cape grapes or whatever it might be, it didn't make a huge difference. It made a small difference, but it reminded me, and reminded when we campaigned outside those supermarkets, reminded everybody else that apartheid and its goods and its reality is absolutely embedded in our society. It's all around us. And so through those personal acts, things could be collectivized and turned into something systemic. It could be turned into an action that could force Barclays, one of the biggest banks in the UK, to withdraw. It could lead to so many councils being apartheid-free zones. One of the activities we used to do, for instance, was go around all the shops in the town and find out whether they sold South African goods or not, and draw up a map, an apartheid-free map, to empower people to know where they could go and shop without buying South African goods. And again, that mapped the individual onto the individual shop, onto the locality, and then forced the council into declaring an apartheid-free zone. So I think I wouldn't counterpose individual and the collective, the personal action, the systemic action. It's finding ways of acting which bring those two together. And the third, and this is really important, and we could probably discuss it more when we talk about the academic boycott, it was systemic, it was not personal, right? It wasn't against individual South Africans. I mean, after all, we acted in solidarity with those fleeing from apartheid. We acted in solidarity with those fighting apartheid, whether they were black or white or colored, whatever. It was to do with those who were embedded in and facilitated the institutions of apartheid. And again, I think that's very important. So let me now finish by looking at the arguments against. As Johanna says, with retrospect, everybody supported sanctions. And everybody thought Mandela was wonderful. Everybody loved Nelson Mandela. Everybody sang Free Nelson Mandela. In 1987, Margaret Thatcher stood against sanctions at the Commonwealth meeting, the heads of Commonwealth states in Vancouver. And when she was asked why, she said that the ANC is, I'm trying to remember her exact phrase, I've got it here. She said it was a typical terrorist organization. Okay. The ANC were called terrorists because they were involved in armed struggle against South Africa. When I was involved in student politics, conservative students would have badges saying, "Hang Nelson Mandela." They're a bit embarrassed about it now, but I remember them walking around with these loathsome badges. So the first argument was the ANC is a terrorist organization. What gave the lie to that, of course, was the fact that they did have such widespread support. They did represent, they were the voice of the liberation movement. The second argument, which is the complete converse of that, was suddenly to go from seeing the organizations of Black people as terrorists to suddenly have a huge concern for Black people. To say, oh, well, this is terrible. The sanctions will lead to a recession, which will be economically bad for Black people. Poor Black people will lose their jobs. Poor Black people won't have wages. It will force them into poverty. And that's where being able to say, but it's the Black organizations themselves, it's the Black people, it's the Black liberation movement, which is calling for this to happen, was so powerful in just dismissing that argument. The third argument was one of ineffectiveness. Well, it was quite interesting that if sanctions were so ineffective, why on earth did the government spend so much energy in trying to stop them, both the South African and the British government? In 1988, the British government passed into law a Local Government Act which said that local councils cannot use any considerations which are not financial in deciding on procurement. In other words, you can't have boycotts. You can't have a decision based on the fact that you want nothing to do with an apartheid and genocidal regime. And interestingly, of course, that's happening all over again in the United Kingdom, where they're trying to force through legislation which will make sanctions against Israel impossible. So ineffectiveness is given the lie by their own activities, quite apart from the other points I made about the effectiveness. And the final argument, which you found back then, plus ça change, is it will isolate your allies, especially in the academic boycott. The argument is these are good guys. Right? These are guys who are, struggling, and we need debate. And it's through debate we will get change. Well, the first thing, of course, is that through debate we haven't got change. Things have only got better. Right? As a strategy of change, it's been completely counterproductive. Exactly as Luthuli said when he launched the armed struggle. He said, look, for 50 years we've been arguing peacefully. We've been trying to debate. We've been trying to use moral arguments. And all that's happened is that things have got worse. More of our children die of poverty. More of our children starve. That the argument that, just argue with us, debate with us, that strategy doesn't work. The second thing is that many of those people who say, oh, we want to debate with you, well, they will debate. But then in their everyday work, they still sustain the structures of apartheid. They still sustain the apartheid military. And again, and I'm sure you'll hear more of that in a moment, you look at Israel and exactly the same is true. Israeli universities are central to the military complex in Israel. The third thing is that through the boycott, you actually empower those in whether it be South Africa or Israel who want to achieve change, who want to do something progressive, because they can say that there's a cost if we don't do it. If we don't do it, we're going to be isolated. And many South African academics, some of the best examples, people with whom I still have contacts and still work, even though it personally disadvantaged them, would argue for the boycott because it empowered those who are arguing for change in South Africa. So again, these are familiar arguments. So I'll just finish, in a sense, by echoing Johanna. I sometimes say that my entire political life has been making things get worse a bit more slowly. That terrible sense that, probably since the end of the post-war boom in the mid-70s, there have been cuts, there's been recession, there's been increasing inequality, there's been increasing authoritarianism. All our fights haven't been useless, because without them, I think things would have been even worse. But they tried to arrest that slide backwards. I still remember watching on television Mandela coming out of prison. I still remember when Barclays withdrew from South Africa. I remember the 1994 elections. I was in South Africa when the ANC had their first ever election meeting in the Cape. And it was the one time in my life where I was involved in a tiny way, in a secondary way, in a tertiary way, in something that made a difference. It made a change. And remember, what's being asked of us, and again, I go back to where I started, what's being asked of us is not to do anything extreme. People aren't asking us to go out of our way to support them. They're simply asking us to stop buying the bombs that kill them. And I really can't see how one can say no to such a modest and such a consequential demand.
Thank you so much, Steve. This was very comprehensive in several ways. So now we'll turn right away to Sami, and hopefully later in the discussion, maybe Steve, you can say just a little bit more about the logistics of the academic boycott component at the time that you talked less about, but we can get to that in the discussion. So Sami, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for that wonderful intervention. I actually feel like I can yield my time back and just tell you all to insert apartheid Israel for apartheid South Africa, because a lot of what you said sort of echoes what we're experiencing. First of all, thank you, Johanna, Aya, and the collective that you've formed for this invitation. And I want to begin just also quickly by saying that this isn't, on one hand, yeah, we say, this genocide is 200 plus days and counting. But in many ways, I think it's important to stress that it's a 76-year-old genocide, and it's 76 years and 2 weeks of genocide and apartheid and settler colonialism. And I say that because it's important, and it's important because when the ceasefire comes, I think a lot of people are going to think the genocide ended, or those two correlate. The beginning of a ceasefire ends the genocide. And I think it's really important that we recognize that the ceasefire doesn't end the genocide, that Palestinians are undergoing ethnic cleansing, the whole gamut of crimes that have been going on for too long. And so that, we're not going home after the ceasefire, and because the fear is that there's a ceasefire and then a liberal government, and you wipe the crimes, just as we wiped the crimes in the US, that slavery was then, or settler colonialism was then, and there are new governments. And so it's really important to keep that and check that. So as Johanna said, I'll try to be as quick as possible. As she said, I've been involved in a number of BDS campaigns in the last 20 years, and was around at the beginning of the formation of the movement in Palestine. I think one thing that, and I'll begin here, is what Steve was saying, that it's important to recognize where the call for boycott is coming from, that it's not a call that, we're making in our dorm rooms or in our office places somewhere in the US or the UK or wherever we all are, but that it's coming from Palestine. And so in 2004, the Palestinian Campaign for Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACB, announced an academic and cultural boycott, and I'll speak to that in a minute. But the year after, the BDS movement essentially was formed, and the BNC, which is the BDS National Council, the BNC, is the coalition that sort of leads this movement from Palestine. And I think it's important to stress that it's not an organization, it's a coalition, and it includes just about every Palestinian faction, force, union, and collective that you can think of, right? So it is a consensus position, and in fact, some might argue that the ceiling is where it's at because it's a consensus, right? And it's important, I think, for our conversation to just kind of recognize the role of the BNC as the sort of that coalition that is leading the charge and making the call and asking us to boycott in particular ways. So, what is the academic boycott call, or sort of why an academic boycott? And I think also Steve mentioned the sports boycott in South Africa, and I think what's important is that the parallel to the sports boycott in the case of Palestine is academic and culture, because this is how Israel brands itself, is through the academia and culture. And so why academic boycott? Because Israeli universities are so entrenched in the system of apartheid and actually are a founding pillar of that system. And I think it's not just that they are complicit, it's way beyond that, that they are a pillar of sustaining this apartheid regime. And I think I'd want to point you to a recent book some of you may have heard of by Maya Wind called Towers of Ivory and Steel, which goes through and details this, the various sort of complicities and entanglements of Israeli academia. So Israeli academia, and not just involved in the system of apartheid, but also in scholasticide, which is sort of what we see happening in Gaza today, which is the complete erasure of education institutions and universities. So these universities, these Israeli universities, they're founded as land grab institutions, right? So for example, Haifa University is built in a region where there are which was traditionally mostly Palestinian, to bring in Jews, right? So you're coming into to university, you come and settle there. Ben Gurion University was built in a sparsely populated area of the Naqab in the south. In post-1967 and the occupation, there was the expansion of Hebrew University and the opening of into the West Bank and the opening of Ariel University. So these are primarily also these institutions, the 12 or 13 institutions are land grab institutions. There's also military collaboration, right? So you have universities that sustain these large weapons producers. You've probably all heard of Elbit Systems now and Rafael. So these universities have partnerships with them. They have joint centers, and they have programs that train soldiers, right? Depending on the university, you have different types of programs. These universities also offer legal frameworks for the bombing of cities, right? So in May 2021, you had the Law and National Security Program offered a defense of Israel's offensive in the Gaza Strip. Tel Aviv University developed the Dahya Doctrine, which is the doctrine of disproportionate force, that calls for the destruction of the national infrastructure and intense suffering among the civilian population as a strategy of warfare. These universities privilege soldiers, right? So they're given access to dorms, scholarships that are only for veterans, course credits for reserve service, so these kinds of things. But also, and as I was saying about sort of the parallel with sports, is Israeli society relies on academia and culture as pillars of legitimacy in the West, right? These sort of foundations, these pillars, create that kind of liberal, open, tolerant society, right? And that's the image that Israel tries to present to the world. But underpinning all that is the ethnic cleansing and apartheid and genocide. And that's what we need to expose. And I think there are a lot of new people coming to this now, seeing this live stream genocide and realizing this open and liberal and tolerant image that we've been sold was a falsity. But Palestinians have been trying to convince people to sort of open their eyes way before, right? October 7. So the importance of the academic boycott, I think, there was another point that I had noted down as Steve was speaking about they attack you for being for the boycott being ineffective, and it's quite funny because like choose your arguments. It's either ineffective where you're coming at it with millions of dollars fighting it. You're creating laws, anti-BDS laws. I mean, which one is it, right? Pick your argument and stick with it. And so, one of the things that people will say is that it's symbolic, especially when you're trying to pass a resolution in an association. And I'll speak to the Anthropology Association sort of campaign in a bit. But people will say that it's symbolic, and I really, I think, would urge us all to kind of recognize that the symbolic is always has material ramifications, right? And so it's not that the symbolic is in one realm and the material is in the other, but the symbolic has material ramifications. And one of the sort of ramifications, again, Steve spoke about, was the kind of inspiration and energy that this gives to people back in Palestine, right? But also the kind of ramifications it has about the legitimacy of what Israeli academia is, right? And that has material reverberations, material ramifications that will continue. That it's also the academic boycott. I think what's important is sometimes we feel like we're working in our offices, that it's you're not out in the streets, but it's important also to recognize that this is an act of resistance, an act of confrontation, act of anti-colonial resistance that we're being asked to take on as what we can do globally, right, outside of Palestine, in where many of you are in the sort of colonial West, the kind of confrontation that you can take on against your administrations, right? So, and it consolidates a feeling into an action, right? So all that you are feeling, all that you are seeing, all the anger, all the sort of helplessness, it consolidates that into action, right? So you can divest, participate in divestment actions on campus. You can participate in association boycotts or trying to pass boycott resolutions, one or the other, actually. You can participate in forcing the closure of study abroad programs, not attending conferences or seminars or lectures in Israel. And PACB has a set of guidelines of what would constitute, how you would sort of take on the act of an academic boycott. So what kind of things you could boycott or you should boycott. I'm not going to get into that. I don't have time for that. But one of the key things that bears repeating is that the boycott is institutional, not individual, right? So it targets complicity, not identity, right? We're not targeting individual Israeli scholars for their identity. We're targeting Israeli institutions for their complicity, right? The one thing, the one time it would sort of target individuals is when that individual represents an institution. So, for example, if they're a dean or a rector, right, a director of a center, and they're giving a talk and they're representing their institution, that would, then you're targeting, because you're targeting the institution and its complicity rather than the identity of a scholar. The other kind of side benefits that I think is also important in thinking of academic boycotts is the way that this work also builds networks, right? So it's not just about the academic boycott per se, but what happens in the process of building a campaign, right? And the kind of networks you build. And those networks bring people to the street, right? So in the last 10 years or so, you have people who are building these campaigns, working across campuses, working, building these networks that then when 2021 comes around and there is a bombing of Gaza, people can draw on those networks to come out in the street. In 2023, people can come, you're not starting from scratch, you're working, people have built these networks over time. And so, when you're not in the streets, you might be at home working on these boycott campaigns, but then you can easily mobilize to get back on the streets. So then you have things like, a protest in Congress or in a train station that we saw. And what are those demands? They're the S in sanctions, right? When you're protesting a university president, what is the demand? It's an academic boycott or it's divestment, right? So protest and boycott then complete each other in different ways. I think that's also important to note. I think the last few words I'll say on my experience with the Anthro boycott campaign, which might be relevant for some of you if you're trying to also take on things in your associations. One thing is that it's not just about the win. I think I learned that is that in many ways the win was kind of anticlimactic, and that it's important to prepare for the day after that win. That the win is not the end point, right? So Palestine is not going to be free when you win a particular campaign. And so you need to be prepared for how to continue that work and build on that win, and recognize that victory comes through the accumulation of wins, right? So incremental gains that we need to build on, that lead to ultimately the victory. And so, and along with that, it's important to also think about, so with the BDS movement, it is always about maintaining ethical principles and strategic effectiveness, right? So we're committed to certain principles, the three demands, which are, ending the occupation, the right of return, a full equality of Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? You don't compromise on liberation, but you have to think strategically and how to be effective, and that it's not just about, just nice slogans, right? So you have to be goal-oriented. And I think also important alongside that is to think about sort of what are achievable goals, right? So of course, publicly, you're shooting for a BDS win, right? Getting your institution, for example, to adopt an academic boycott or end the study abroad. But internally in your campaign and your struggle, you also have to think of, like, how do you define wins internally for your campaign, right? It might be that it's dominating social media and educating people. It might be to sort of really hurt Israel's image, and create a sort of a huge image issue for them. So there's just different ways that you can define those wins internally, and through that figure out sort of what's your target or how to build that campaign. And so I think, I'll end there. And just sort of my last point, I think, is that it's important to think of, again, what Steve was saying, that we are being asked to do globally is to be part of, there is resistance in Palestine on the ground, but we're a global movement, and how do we offer, sort of expand that? How do we expand resistance in ways that we can do from our own context, right? And how do we sort of grow a global movement? I think this global movement one has to see as a kind of great power, as you would see the US empire or Russia or BRICS or what have you, or NATO. So the global movement for Palestine, this global solidarity movement, is a great power. And, you know, it's the US imposed sanctions on Russia, and that didn't change things. Ultimately, Russia is still in Ukraine. So when you are fighting for BDS and things aren't changing today, it doesn't it doesn't mean that things won't change tomorrow. Things change ultimately takes time. So I'll end there. And I know it's approaching 9. I'm not sure how long we have.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we had 90 minutes scheduled, so we already are, we have 59 out of the 90 minutes are over, so half an hour more. Thank you both so much. I think both of you gave us so much more beyond academic boycott, right? About the general boycott movement and also the psychological dynamics and so many other interesting questions. So that is very rich. But I am wondering, before we go to questions from the audience and discussion, if each of you could just add a little bit of kind of more practical, perhaps, information about your organizing experience, and not too long because I do want to have time for discussion, but if you could just add a tiny bit about you know, the actual experience of organizing the academic boycott specifically, including any kind of like backlash and repression that you faced and how you circumvented that, or how you know, managed to still be successful in the end. So just maybe from each of you, like 2 or 3 minutes, some practical takeaways, perhaps, for anyone who wants to get more involved in academic boycott specifically. Steve, do you want to start? You're muted.
Sorry, I've moved because we have babies in the house and it's bath time and very noisy. So I've moved downstairs. If you're wondering why suddenly I'm in a different place. I did just want to echo, because I think it's really important, a couple of things that Sammy said. The first is the question of what is winning? What is winning? And I remember, you know, when in the 1970s and the 1980s, people talked about defeating apartheid, it seemed impossible. Right. And back then, when people said, look, in the end, we will win, it seemed fanciful, but it happened. Right. So I do think that one needs that faith, partly because the very act of resistance is humanizing. You know, for me, you know, the greatest and the most fundamental critique of collective action and crowds, I study crowds, I have all my career, is that they dehumanize you. They make you like sheep. They take away your agency. Actually, what happens in crowds is you gain agency because you're empowered to challenge those who normally determine your way of living. And that's why authorities are so afraid of collective action, because it's humanizing. And that's a win in itself, to stay human. I mean, you know that, Johanna, from your work on the Holocaust. A victory over oppression is in part to refuse to be dehumanized by it. And part of the struggle and the process, I think, is really powerful. Now, in terms of how you organize, I mean, the first thing I would say always is collectivize. Do it through the union. So, I mean, in the UK, it was the AUT. Now we've changed our name to the UCU. It's the academic union, and local unions through which you would pass policies around the boycott. The second thing then is that you would organize at a local level or a school level. The third thing I would say is to be flexible, because I think one of the problems is that there are complexities to the academic boycott. The line between what is institutional, what is individual, is not always clear, but you can always try to discredit a political movement by trying to find grey areas. There are always grey areas where there are categories, but it is undoubtedly true there are some cases where, you know, the boycott doesn't occur, doesn't apply. So, for instance, you know, we had ANC members who were coming over out of South Africa for respite. You wouldn't have the academic boycott against them if they were academics. And on the other hand, there are things which self-evidently, do fall under the rubric of the boycott. So, for instance, when you have institutional exchanges, when you have supports for particular units, when you have representative individuals, when you have conferences which are organized by institutions. So there is, pick your targets clearly and be sensible and be flexible. But I mean, in the end, it comes down to collectivize, collectivize, collectivize. And if you can do that, I think then, the process itself is a victory, irrespective of the outcomes, although, of course, you want to achieve those outcomes as well.
Thank you. And that also speaks to the issue that comes up again and again, and probably we'll have discussion about it with individual versus institutional boycott and the arguments about harming those people within the societies that are fighting, right? So we'll get back to that, I hope, in the discussion. Sami, what would you add?
Yeah, I think collectivizing is super important. I think that would be number one. And actually, when Steve was talking, I was thinking also, in addition to that, get some of those members into positions of power, right? But collectivize, and then so you're not, there's a difference between getting into sort of close to power on your own versus being part of a collective and answerable to that collective, and then getting into sort of positions. And when I say positions of power, I mean, for example, in your academic associations, if you are taking over the association and one of your members is president or vice president, right? Then you and they're working as part of your collective, then you have a voice inside, or within your academic, in your university. Again, if you're they're now like these, Faculty for Justice in Palestine, and that's a form of collectivization of faculty, which was not there before the last year. Which is really important because usually faculty are not collectivized, and especially if there are no unions in those universities, they don't have that kind of support. But then having those faculty who have an ear of the president or the ear of the provost or the ear of, right, then you have a sort of way in and can sort of work that inside outside. I think Aya started us off with that quote where in order to reach liberation, we need multiple ways of struggling on multiple fronts, and using all our creativity to get there. Yeah.
Johanna, can I add one other thing? Because I think it's obviously absolutely central and critical, especially around the BDS movement. I mean, it didn't apply in South Africa, but it applied, the obvious argument used against us is that we're being anti-Semitic. Okay, that's the one they throw at us every time. And one of the interesting things for me about what's happened over the last few months is the way in which Jewish faculty have collectivized non-Jewish, non-Zionist Jewish faculty who previously were silent, who are beginning to say "not in my name," who are beginning to say that when Netanyahu says what he's doing is for Jews, they're saying we're Jews and you're not doing it for me. So we've seen that with the statements by Jewish academics in the States. We saw it in Canada. We've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in Scotland. We've even seen it in my university. And the power of those groups is that when the administrations make claims about anti-Semitism, they can say, no, that actually the very notion that there is only one Jewish tradition, reducing that richness of Jewish traditions to one position, is actually a form of stereotyping and is a form of anti-Semitism. That there are multiple voices. Yes, there are some voices which support what the Israeli state is doing, but there are many, many Jewish voices that don't. So I think the role of the self-organization of Jewish faculty to undermine that attempt to claim that being against what the Israeli state does, in other words, a political position, is a form of racism, is about ethnicity, which it isn't at all. So I think I personally feel a responsibility because, as I say, the Israeli state claims to speak for me in what it does. And the very least I can do is to say, no, you don't speak for me. And our administrations and the presidents of our university need to hear that really loudly and really clearly.
Absolutely, and that isn't preventing people from calling us self-hating anti-Semitic Jews, right? So that whole delegitimization.
Oh, we all hate each other. Why not hate ourselves?
Yeah. Sami, if you could just very briefly tell us in 1 minute or two, and then we'll finally open up for questions. What exactly did the American Anthropological Association endorse? So you said it was some kind of statement about boycotting complicit institutions, but like, how does it look like concretely? What is the American Anthropological Association, due to the campaign that you successfully co-led, now doing concretely? There's a resolution, but how does it translate?
Concretely, they're trying to sabotage the democratic vote. Concretely.
Okay, that's bad news. I was hoping for good news. Like, what is the positive
Yeah,
sign?
so yeah, actually, no, so that's actually something I think one we need to be careful about is that when you pass a boycott resolution, then there's going to be a backlash, whether public or I think in our case it was private, and underneath that the association got threats. And now I'm speaking from, I'm not representing anyone. This is just my view of things. And I think they're trying to turn back the clock. Because if you look since October 7, the AAA has not stood up for an anthropologist in Germany who was kicked out of Max Planck Institute. They didn't stand up for Nader Shalhoub Kevorkian, who was arrested by the Israelis, who's not an anthropologist, but very close and does a lot of medical anthropology. They have not spoken out against scholasticide. So they haven't done all these things. And so we've called them out on on this kind of complicity. The current board is really problematic. There's certain people on the board that are problematic. And I think so that's one thing. Concretely, though, also just on a maybe a serious note, is that the AAA did commit to certain things. I have to go back to the website, and I can share the link here in a minute once I'm done talking. But there are certain things that it would commit, for example, to not advertise any positions from Israeli universities. It would not advertise not advertise Israeli universities, and not have those universities at the at the book, whatever the fair or whatever it is. But it also committed to speaking out in support of students and faculty who are speaking, defend our rights basically, and that it hasn't done. And there are things that, associations aren't necessarily invested. Some might not be, but ours was not invested per se in, companies that were complicit. Yeah.
Okay, so it's really kind of a very initial baby step in a way, but as you said, it all accumulates.
But this is what I meant by that, the fact that, you win, but then you have to kind of think about how to continue building on that win. And in some cases, I think this is also the time maybe where you create new associations and you say, to hell with these old associations. And genocide sort of pushes us to think of new world orders in a sense, and thinking of, right, like a psychology of resistance collective can grow into an association with a journal. right?
Mhm.
And then kind of say, you know, we're no longer going to, it becomes a sort of mainstream. So it's not a psychology of resistance association, but an association that has certain values, and does the same work and push, you know, people go elsewhere. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I just come in and I'll shut up after that. I'm sorry we're talking too much, but I think that last point is incredibly important. I know there are debates going on in all sorts of places, given the failure of some of our most prominent organizations to take any sort of position on what's going on as to whether we do need different and new organizations as well. And perhaps one of the things that can be discussed is how we can get people together to have that conversation and think how we move forward.
Yes, and that is absolutely the spirit, as you probably recognized, Sami, of this kind of collective, right, prefigurative organizing outside of the institutions that we are deeply disappointed with and have exhausted a lot of our time and energy trying to change. And so therefore we are doing things elsewhere.
but I think we might, and I know this is, again, in psychology, you might have to think of this differently, but we might be in a moment where when you leave, you take 1,000 people with you rather than 50 people, right? Like if you leave an association and take 50 people, it's great. You have a nice new association that's fringe. When you take 1,000 people with you, then you've created a existential problem for the association. And you might not be there in psychology. I think technically we probably are there in anthropology. I don't know if anyone, you know, has the capacity to create a new association, but in any case,
All right, so let's see which questions there are, what need for more discussion. We also have the Jamboard, we can look there, but in the meantime, just to check first if anyone here wants to jump in.
Can I?
Sure, Hossam, yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I'm lucky my flight got delayed so that I can listen to the rest of this talk. So thank you very much for so I have been into a very similar debate, and maybe you touched upon this point, but the main argument that was thrown in my face again is academic boycott. Actually, two arguments. One of them is that science should be above all these, and we should just focus on science, do science as a higher moral target. So this is one argument, but the other one that is a bit more interesting, and I would like to hear your opinions regarding, is it's as follows. Okay, we should embrace Israelis so that they don't feel isolated and they don't feel alone, so that they don't go more extreme, so that they feel we understand them, so that we can change their mind. Something is wrong with this argument, but I don't know what. So if you can, I don't know, give me your reflections on these two arguments, that would be amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sami or Steve, would either of you like to respond?
you want to go ahead, Steve?
Okay, so two things. I mean, first of all, it is perfectly true that one of the key ideological moves of the Israeli state is to weaponize threat. It is, you know, the notion that the Holocaust serves as the definition of the nature of Israel, and therefore anything is interpreted as the next Holocaust coming, justifying just about anything. I mean, for instance, I was struck, if you remember, early on in the conflict, when there was a bomb fell on one of the hospitals, and it turned out to be a missile that had fallen short. Now, the reporting, which said that it was Israeli fire, was inaccurate, but the Israeli media turned it into a blood libel, as if it is something specific to Israel and something which poses an existential threat to Israel. So that notion of using threat is not something, again, which is a psychological given, the system weaponizes threat. It's always weaponized threat. It's fundamental to its raison d'etre. So first of all, I think it shows a new front of struggle. One needs to contest the constructions of threat in Israeli ideology, and one needs to understand how they work. But the second thing is that when you say, well, if we're nasty, then things might get worse. The question is, things can't get much worse. I mean, as you said, Sami, the genocide, and by genocide, I want to make this point because I think it's a really important point, which often is misunderstood. Right? Genocide is a destruction of a people qua people. It can take many forms. There can be cultural genocide, educational genocide, etc. They are ways of stopping people cohering collectively. Now, the Holocaust is a particular form of genocide which involves killing every single individual. And not every genocide is a Holocaust. The Holocaust is very specific. And it seems to me that Israel is conducting a genocide. It wants to destroy the Palestinian people as a people. It's perfectly prepared to kill a number of them to achieve that, but it doesn't necessarily want to destroy every single Palestinian. If Palestinians left, dispersed, gave over the lands completely, there would still be the genocide. So I would argue that it is quite right to say what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank is a genocide. I'd say it's quite wrong to liken it to the Holocaust. And so I think one needs to be very careful indeed in terms of what's going on. But the notion of a genocide, the old settler slogan of a land without a people for people without a land, that project has been going on for a very long time. And that project is leading to what we see today. And things are so bad that the notion of, accept the status quo because things might get worse, seems to me to accept something which fundamentally actually is as bad as it gets. I think the real issue is to challenge its legitimation and challenge its support, because the other thing, and it's quite simple, it's quite clear, Israel could not exist without the support it's given. It couldn't exist without the political support it's given by the United States. It couldn't exist economically without the economic support. It couldn't fight its wars without the military support. And so I do think that those are the things you really need to target. As I say, the things, to say it might get worse rather underplays how bad it is right now.
I was gonna, I think, Hassam, the last part of your question about, we're gonna scare people away, or how to. I think it ultimately, no people has been freed without pressure, right? And so boycott is about putting pressure on the oppressor. I think, people there are Israeli anti-Zionists who will stand with you, and you search for them. They're not many. But the idea of, I think Steve had started with something like this, the debate and dialogue and talking, they're tactics to buy time, right? Because as long as you're just talking and talking, so we can talk till forever. And so if we're going to sort of be afraid that some people are going to be turned off in Israel, well, I'm sorry, there are bigger issues out there, and let them join our movement and see how welcoming we are, right? I think that's key. Is if people want to adopt the principles, then we welcome them with open arms, right? I think there was a question also in the Jamboard about how to move ahead with a boycott when it will be controversial at your institution. And in some ways, my answer is a bit similar. Is that, can you do something as individuals or groups at an institution who will not boycott? And I think the point is that, as I ended, is that boycott is confrontational, resistance is confrontational. And we need to confront. And this is the thing with, like, when they try to bring you towards dialogue, is because they don't want you to confront, right? They want you to be pleasant and civil and be a good, I don't know, good Arab or a good Jew or a good whatever, right? And not to confront. And when you confront, and then yeah, you enter into the realm of controversy, and that's what scares the powerful, but that's what you need. So I think you need to be willing to confront. And I always I think people get the whole sort of Gandhi and nonviolence thing backwards, is that Gandhi's, whether you like him or not, but like the philosophy was confrontation, right? It wasn't you sit at home and you say peace and kumbaya. It was confrontational. So even from a kind of Gandhian nonviolence perspective, there's still confrontation. I think that's really important to keep in mind, is that we are, Palestinians are asking you to confront. They're not asking you to just do something. And when Steve says, it's a very modest kind of demand about not buying something, but it's a confrontation, right? And so it doesn't maybe require much from you, but it is also, I think it requires, there's the consumer boycott, but then there's also what BDS movement is asking, is for us to confront our institutions, right? And that's right. I don't care if you buy X company products. I'm more interested that you're collectivizing and confronting an institution to not use those products, because that's a bigger contract than your $10.
And can you, Sami, say a little bit more? Both of you talked about the difference between individual and institutional boycott, and that is the one that I just here mentioned the most as the argument, how it will harm individual Israeli scholars, especially those who are involved in discussion and so on. We already, in whatever, confronting in some way their institutions, but we already heard a few arguments from both of you. I think especially Steve, you mentioned that on the one hand, well, I mean, one argument is just, okay, some kind of academic harm, as opposed to universities in Gaza all being destroyed and many professors and students killed, right? But another argument is also simply that you mentioned, Steve, which is more strategic, that the boycott also allows those critical individuals within Israel to put some more leverage or pressure on their own institutions and say, look, this is harming us, we need to change, right? So that's one strategic argument. But could you say a little bit more, Sami, about how PACB also defines this individual versus institutional boycott? So for example, you mentioned if someone wants to give a talk as a dean of an Israeli institution, that would clearly be against, right, the guidelines, you would boycott that. But does it also extend to academics simply presenting with their Israeli academic affiliation? Would it include, not co-authoring papers with Israeli academics unless they maybe remove their affiliation? Like, what are some boundaries, and how can one help clarify that difference between
great question. I think so. It's when, as I was saying, it's about institutional complicity, right? So, and the South African case was a blanket boycott, so they were boycotting individuals as well. And what PACB went through sort of leaps and bounds to try to differentiate between an institution and an individual. So you can take the kind of radical position and say that anyone who's working in institutions. So, for example, I work at Northwestern, and therefore anything I do is giving Northwestern, prestige, and so I'm complicit and I'm connected and I'm representing no matter what. There is an argument to be made there, but PACB basically said, look, we're going to distinguish between what is mere affiliation and representation. So when I go out to an anthropology conference and I give a talk and my affiliation says, Sami, Northwestern University in Qatar, that's an affiliation. I'm not representing the institution. And if I talk about apartheid and genocide, my institution also says he doesn't represent us, right? These are not the views of the institution. We love Israel. I don't know what, right? So it goes both ways. And so the idea is that a professor who's co-writing with you from Hebrew University and they have Hebrew University, that's a mere affiliation. It's not that they represent, and their institution, again, they might be talking about the genocide and the dismantling of Israel, and Hebrew University might be like, we have nothing to do with this person. But you might be co-authoring and doing a project, and you have a institutional connection with that. So you have a grant, for example, and on that grant is Clark University and Hebrew University have applied for that grant. That's an institutional. Now, when you write that paper, the whole thing is like, blah, right? That's boycottable. And so it's that institutional, the kind of MOU that's boycottable. And so an Israeli going and giving a talk, I noticed again on the jam, no, actually someone here who said that anyone who stands for genocide. I think we are in a moment. PACB also subscribes to the idea of like a common sense boycott, right? So it is kind of common sense that if your co-author is a genocide supporter, that you're not co-authoring with them, right? And if you are co-authoring with them, I tell you, Johanna, what the F are you doing, right? And people would be like, but this becomes common sense because, it goes kind of beyond what the PACB call is asking for. But it's common sense. No one's going to fault anyone for saying, or this is a genocide denier or whatnot. So there are forms, someone who's no longer a rector, but they've done all kinds of crazy stuff and made all kinds of crazy comments. Maybe people don't want this person on their campus, right? So. And there are, I think, a lot of gray areas, and I think in those cases, it's always important to reach out to the BNC or to PACB and to sort of check in and ask about those kind of gray areas.
Can I say just, first of all, on the anti-apartheid boycott, I mean, it wasn't completely absolute. So you would say that people who are aligned with the liberation movement, you would have contact with. And again, one of the dynamics of it then was to say it forced people off the fence. You couldn't just sit in a South African apartheid institution claiming I'm not part of the problem unless you did absolutely something about it. And therefore, in some ways, it was a pressure to people to become involved. I suppose in terms of, I mean, there are complexities. As you say, there are gray areas. The first question in my mind is someone having this debate with you in good faith or in bad faith? Right? If they're genuinely in good faith, right, you've won the argument. If they genuinely want to say, look, I accept the principle, but how do we implement it? You can have a debate. If it's being done in bad faith, in other words, they're not at all interested in the distinction at all, even if you could make it, they're just trying to undermine you. I think that's something very different. And I do think the notion of common sense is a really useful point to have. I mean, there are all sorts of criteria you can use. For instance, I mean, as my wife shows in a book, I mean, a lot of the research that's done in Israel is profoundly unethical. I mean, especially in anthropology, but the way in which people get data, through whom they get data, what sort of data they get, whether people give consent and so on and so forth, that would be an absolute criterion as to whether you work with somebody or not. It's pretty clear that you don't do things like review for grants for Israeli institutions. There are plenty of things that are clear. I would say start with the low-hanging fruit, right? Start with the things that are pretty clear. And if you win those, you can take that debate further. And I just want to finish with this point, because I think it's a really important point. because it does seem to me the debate has changed somewhat from, is boycott acceptable to what sort of boycott is acceptable? Because everybody boycotts. The American government boycotts, the British government boycotts extreme settlers, okay? So the debate then becomes, well, look, if you accept the principle of boycott, right, you yourself have accepted that lots of these arguments used against boycott, like it will push them into a corner, don't stand up. So how far are you going to go? If you boycott extreme settlers, do you then boycott those who make their extremism possible? Do you boycott those involved with the defense force and with the army who support those extreme settlers? Do you then boycott, say, the Israeli utility companies, without which the settlements would be impossible? They couldn't exist without water. They couldn't exist without electricity, right? The fascinating thing now is, I think we can say, look, we've won the argument for boycott. As I say, everybody's for boycott. The only question that now remains is what sort of boycott, and that's a fundamental shift. And I think we need to take advantage of that, because I think, as I say, I think the ground is different and things are moving, and we should take advantage of it.
Thank you. I'm splitting attention between a lot of activity in the chat and then here. So first of all, this is really helpful, I think, and this distinction is very oftentimes misunderstood, I believe, and that has led, I think, to many people rejecting boycott based on simply a misunderstanding of what it actually entails with regard to their Israeli colleagues, for example. There were a few more questions in the chat about, some specifics about what to do in each case. I also think this common sense boycott is a good idea to remember, as well as the link that the general BDS movement also has about organic boycott, right? So boycotts that are not necessarily put forward by that institution, that group, but that just kind of emerge from the grassroots. But also communicating, right, the reasons. So for example, there were questions about reviewing papers or grants. I mean, when you get a request to review, hopefully it's anonymous and you don't know the person's affiliation. But if it's, for example, a grant request, a review from an Israeli funder, it's very clear that you can say, and I think one should communicate clearly, right, based on the principles of academic boycott, I am not accepting this request. The more we communicate clearly about it, the more it also shapes norms and gets that moral pressure across, and kind of the isolation that is supposed to make boycott effective, right? So important to remember not just the material aspects of boycott, but also the symbolic and identity-based and affective-based kind of processes that I think both Steve and Sami also spoke to, because of your, backgrounds as anthropologists and psychologists.
So just
yeah.
a couple of things, like Serdar was saying about where the funding and stuff. So, I think there is another thing, is that an Israeli scholar who's at, I don't know, Hebrew University, will have access to research funds from Hebrew University. From a PACB perspective, that wouldn't make them, and if they use that funding, that wouldn't make it boycottable, right? If I have funding, this again goes back to the mere affiliation. I mean, you can take, again, this kind of more die-hard perspective, but you get into all kinds of issues, then effectively you end up boycotting all Israelis, right? Because they're going to be using money. But if their talk is somehow funded, like, there is an actual some sort of institutional grant or something, right, outside the normal channels that you would have, like we may all get funding from our institutions to go to a conference, then that might be boycottable. So I think that those get into sort of muddy waters, and one could then have a discussion about those. But it just, I think one just needs to be careful and not to to make sure that you're boycotting for complicity and not for identity. That not you just saw an Israeli scholar, red flag, and you want to boycott that Israeli scholar. I mean, I can understand that, but then, and in some ways, if it was an Italian scholar and this was Italy, we wouldn't be having this conversation, to be honest, right? And it's just that if we just see them as Israeli scholars, we probably, wouldn't be having this conversation. But because they're, Jewish scholars, it becomes a kind of minefield, right? And so I think that it's just important to kind of make that distinction. There's the other thing, I think recently there was a case where they denied someone to publish in a journal, right? And it becomes explosive and it can backfire, right? Because then you end up spending a month trying to say, oh, no, and complicity, not identity, institutional, not individual, and it takes you back, and you're like having to do damage control. So it's just important to keep those things in mind.
And another point I would also just add from the broader BDS campaign, one of their principles that they emphasize is focused and targeted boycott, right? As opposed to this very diffuse, like boycott everything, because then you lose kind of the power of the boycott. So as well as their discussion of levels of complicity, right? And to start with the most complicit companies, for example, in consumer boycott first. So that might also, those two principles might also help address some of the gray zone questions, as well as the question of where to focus our energies on, right? And what to start with.
There's a question about the climate crisis and the intersection, and I think Greta Thunberg has become like a huge sort of Palestine. Did I say her name right? Is a huge Palestine sort of activist, and has made statements on academic and cultural boycott and stuff. And I think it was really inspiring to see sort of the maybe two strands, the kind of liberal strand, and then the way she's taken the climate activism and the intersection that climate activism is, or Palestine is also a climate issue. And I think, one of the things that the BDS movement has worked on for the last 2 decades is the intersectionality, and to think about the different ways that Palestine is a climate issue, and Palestine is also a race issue, and that these things are they go both ways. And how do you support climate activism, and how do climate activists support Palestine? So it definitely that is something within Palestine activism. You will hear that. And then sort of connecting with those climate activists who are thinking about those issues.
A couple of points. I mean, one on that, at one level I agree, but I think one of the big mistakes that I saw in lots of local anti-apartheid groups was that activists would put off new members by kind of assuming they should have the right line on everything, right? They should have the right line on understanding the role of international capital. They would have to be socialists, etc., etc. And so the conditions for entering the movement were, in a sense, the forms of understanding which derived from being in the movement. And for me, being in the anti-apartheid movement, all you had to do was to support the boycott. Now, my sense was, as people came in, understood the nature of South Africa and who was sustaining South Africa, it would develop their understanding. So you could have those debates. But to make it a condition, even informally, so anybody who has got the wrong line on whatever is frowned upon, I think is really dangerous and really limiting. The other point I would make, again, I mean, I think in a lot of these things, there are complex areas, but it makes sense, as I say, to start with the low-hanging fruit, with the things that are absolutely clear. And once people are involved in those, then you can have debates about the more complex cases. But there are certain cases, as I say, which are unambiguous. You do not review for a state institution. You don't have formal links with the institution and so on. You don't accept work which is ethically and morally compromised. You wouldn't do that anyway, but a lot of work is. So I think be clear, go for the low-hanging fruit, get people involved, and then you can address those trickier areas. I mean, to start off by walking into a minefield is not a good strategy. The one other thing I would say is I do think that the flip side of trying to challenge state institutions is to support Palestinians and to support Palestinian education. That was always true. We, in the anti-apartheid movement, we showed solidarity with the ANC. We supported the liberation movement in all sorts of ways. And similarly, I think that it is really helpful to make the point that this is a positive campaign. Sometimes we're painted as being negative. We're saying, don't do this, don't do that. The question of how do we support Palestinian scholars and Palestinian institutions to rebuild, given their utter destruction and given the difficulty of how they operate on the West Bank, I think is equally important. And those are demands we should be putting to our institutions as well. That's where we should be having twinning. That's where we should be supporting scholars. That's where, we should have study exchanges and so forth. And so again, I think a strategy which is seen to be positive and which is seen to challenge things which are unquestionably bad is inevitably going to be more successful.
All right, we are already quite a bit over time. Are there any last very urgent questions or answers? Sami, you look so exhausted. I know it's 9:45 already in Qatar, and you have kids whose bedtime is probably already over, and Steve has bathed the babies in the background somewhere to attend to, so we don't want to take up more of your time. But I think, yeah, as Sami, I believe, said before, this is also about creating networks and knowing, where are the comrades, whom can we talk to, whom can we build with. So these conversations can all be continued in various ways and formats. And you know how to Google people's email addresses and so on. So be in touch, I think, with more questions and discussion, right? Okay. So thank you again, both of you, for taking all of the time, and all of you really for taking all of the time and having such a good discussion. And thank you for joining. And Fuad, I don't know if you want to send around our link to the schedule for our Resistance virtual meeting series. We have a few more sessions coming up, and this will be continued also in the future, if any of you want to join our mailing list or such. All right, so thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and yeah, keep up the good fight.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us, and thanks for joining.
Bye.